mixed with reaction. The original Lich King. This just came out, so I don't know, like, I don't know if this is gonna be good or not. Nobody knows.
We last left off on the eve of launch. Players had bested the Scourge invasion, they had played around with their new talents, and they had enjoyed the new achievement system that came in the pre-patch.
That's a good time.
But now, it was finally time to journey to Northrend. Northrend immediately made a strong impression, no matter what zone you traveled to first. One could easily tell that Blizzard's world designers were not resting on their laurels. Howling Fjord is
that means they were going big dick.
of this, a zone that perfectly married its level design, its visuals, and
Bro, like, this shit was so fucking good, man. You sail in through like this little alcove, right? And like this small little lake, and like above you, there's like giant fucking ships that are chained to the ceiling above you. You don't know if it's gonna fall on you. You come up into this bay. There's a gigantic Vicral citadel, and also a small Alliance fortress there, and you're gonna fucking take that shit on yourself, dude. It felt so good. You go inside that little thing. It was amazing. I love this.
Music to create one of the most evocative locations in the game. And while the Borean Tundra was a little bit weaker and would not stand the test of time, it still did make a strong impression back in the day. Blizzard's narrative improvements were immediately obvious. Both zones threw right into the action as Howling Fjord players struggled against the game's new race of Rykul, and then Borean Tundra players fended off a massive Nairobian attack. Both zones then split off in a few different directions, sending players on various little adventures, helping out the Explorers League, discovering what's up with the New Earthen.
They did this, by the way, for everybody that didn't know, is because in Burning Crusade, everybody started in the same zone, and it created this bottleneck of players. So Blizzard's idea for Wrath was to have everybody go into either Howling Fjord or Boring Tundra. And that way, it would separate the player base, and you wouldn't have as many hang-ups. That's why they had both zones.
Helping the Kalawak out and then taking down a Scourge base with the Saurian.
Right.
Borean Tundra then had the subzone of Kuldara, which was the home of the Nexus.
I fucking love
and
that zone.
a focal point of the Nexus War, in which the Blue Dragonflight fought all other magic users at Malagos's behest. Overall, the quality and the pacing of this quest content far outshone that of the Burning Crusade, and players settled in for what was clearly the most immersive world that Blizzard had ever produced. Players would eventually gain those first few levels though, and then they would go to Dragonblight. This was our first taste of the Northrend that we knew from Warcraft 3. A big frozen wasteland, but one that still had diverse points of interest. Kalawak villages, various dragon shrines, and the war zone surrounding Naxxramas. The sheer scale of this zone was mightily impressive, but it got even better than that, with its latter half having some of Blizzard's strongest storytelling to date.
That's true.
Players, having battled the Scourge
Fucking
for much
incredible.
of the zone, would then team up with a hero of their faction, and this was all done with a level.
Do you know how I know this is a video from a long time ago? Is because of all the abilities the guy has. If this was Battle for Azeroth, he'd have like just this much
of storytelling that was just a cut above prior expansions. Then, of course, it all led into the Wrathgate. Now, the Wrathgate was Blizzard's first in-game cinematic. Crude by today's standards, and even by some of the standards of the day, but for Warcraft,
it wasn't the best.
A very large step
Let's be
up.
honest.
And that wasn't all. This directly led into the attack on Undercity. And this all came within the first few levels of the Wrath experience, and it served to further raise up tensions as we went to explore the rest of the continent. Following this up was very hard.
I hated doing Battle for
Grizzly
Undercity on
Hills,
every
Solsar
character.
Basin, and Zul'Drak did not have a strong narratives, but they were all very well realized zones within their own right. Grizzly Hills is probably one of the most emotionally resonant zones, I would say, in an expansion. It's a case where the visuals and the music just came together to make players, well, pretty much feel at home. Zul'Drak didn't really gel with me personally, but it did have a pretty cool
dick, let's be
storyline about
honest.
the trolls selling out by
was
sacrificing their Loa. And then Solsar
it was a
Basin
dick-sucking
was an extremely
zone.
welcome change in pace. His Titan experimentation lab was a lush, dense jungle.
You never did those quests. They were a waste of time. You had to go all the way up there and just do like 2 or 3 things. You never fucking did those. You just went down the bottom. You killed some deer. You killed some crocodiles. You tried to track down the cat. You killed the cat. And then you got mad at the guy guys, then you killed the other guys, and vice versa, and then you do the thing, and you're 80, right? I mean, that's the way that I did. Nobody ever fucking went up and did that. This was literally the only reason why people liked fucking Sholazar Basin is because the quests were simple as fuck. You had him at Nestingwary that said kill 60 fucking mobs, and you went and you killed 60 fucking mobs, and there was no weird kind of go got click on this and make this weird fucking thing. No, you just killed the mobs, they were dead, that was it, and I loved it.
Something almost entirely different from the rest of Northrend. It had solid quests, great visuals, great music, and a interesting enough mutually exclusive faction choice between the Oracles and the Frenzy Pod.
I like this.
Now, by the time players had done all this, they were level...
The only problem with this is that the Oracles were obviously the correct answer. Like, anybody who went Frenzy Heart was a fucking retard. Because the Oracles gave you a mount. And you know what Frenzy Heart gave you? It gave you a toy. Like, you would obviously go... Everybody that was smart was Oracles. And you could tell, like, if somebody was good or not, if they were Oracles or Frenzy Heart. We had this one dipshit in my guild. His name was... I like this guy. I still talk to him. His name was Dakina. And he went Frenzy Heart. Jesus Christ. He was an enhancement shaman. I mean, I think that says it all.
Level 77, and they unlocked Cold Weather Flying, which was a...
Whenever this happened, I got level 77. Instead of going to level... I immediately went over to Icecrown and I farmed titanium for like 3 hours. And I made so much fucking money, it was insane because nobody was there farming. So I just farmed out all of the fucking titanium in the entire game. And I sold that shit. I had so much money at the beginning of Wrath, I could buy anything I wanted. I loved it.
Requirement pretty much for the final two zones.
Easy.
Icecrown Glacier and Storm Peaks.
Icecrown what?
They were level 77, and they unlocked Cold Weather Flying, which was a requirement pretty much for the final two zones. Icecrown Glacier and Storm Peaks. Both of these zones were designed with flying in mind, but in different ways. Icecrown was the seat of Scourge power. You had to fly because it was too dangerous on the ground. The best your faction could do was do small raids from an airship. This is exactly what they needed to make the Lich King feel strong and set the stage and really show you that you couldn't fight him yet. He was too strong. Of course, his raid would not be out for another year. Then with Storm Peaks, they went in a different direction. Rather than being so overtly hostile like Icecrown, it just had such a massive scale that you physically couldn't get around on a ground mount. And this made perfect sense for a Titan-themed zone where human players should feel dwarfed by the ice giants and the Vrykul, the Proto-Drakes, and all the massive Titan structures and engines.
Storm Peaks is what they should have revolutionized questing and zones to be. And instead of that, and you saw a little bit of this with Deepholm. I think Deepholm was another good example of this. Storm Peaks was a zone that whenever you finish Storm Peaks, there are very few people who said Blizzard should remove flying. Flying should be used in order to augment and enhance questing rather than just be a way to trivialize it. I think Storm Peaks was the best example of that. Storm Peaks is flying questing done right.
Both zones had very solid narratives. Storm Peaks had us questing with Thorim, which would be a great tie-in to the future Ulduar raid, and of course the Ulduar dungeons. Fans of Warcraft 3 then got the Bronzebeard reunion that reintroduced Muradin to the story of Warcraft. Storm Peaks overall was a hell of a time. It had cool quests, there was dragon riding, loads of nice little set pieces, and it had a scale that just did not feel like anything WoW had done before. Then over to Icecrown, its narrative started off really strong. Blizzard made excellent use of phasing to give us a fast-paced narrative where we, along with the Argent Crusade, secure a foothold in the most dangerous part of the continent.
I remember this quest specifically right here is because we did this in a group with my friends, and I went AFK in one turret while they killed all of the other mobs in the other turret. I actually wasn't AFK. I was just sitting there doing nothing because I didn't want to have to click the button.
This was one of their strongest set pieces to date, and it was
like
then
level 79
followed
or
up
something at
with
that point.
quests like Crusader Breidenbart, and then a whole host of really strong questing throughout Icecrown, which would see us learn more about Arthas and perform all sorts of covert strikes against the Lich King. This was made all the stronger because of our relationship with the Lich King and how it developed. You'd see him pop up in dungeons, he was at the Wrathgate, you saw him in Zuldrak, you met him in the Howling Fjord, and all of this gave the player a stronger sense of the Lich King and the expansion's antagonist. It showed us what the character that we played in Warcraft 3 had become. and that was very powerful for the story. Northrend had brilliant zones and, for the time, brilliant questing, but that wasn't all. Dungeons were a major part of the experience, and
here's why I liked Northrend questing. I'm gonna look this up. Let me see if I can find it. Is there a picture? No, I guess there's not. Who here went back and they did Zuldrak, or they did Dragonblight, and you would come back to town and everybody would be like they were watching a train wreck stream, because the entire zone would be populated with question marks. It was fucking beautiful.
players gained access to a variety of level-up dungeons as they progressed, and these, unlike in many past times, did a far better job of tying into the narrative of the zones. So the Utgard dungeons were really fantastic in my estimation. They had a nice progression. You were doing the keep while you were leveling, and then you killed King Yermin in Pinnacle at max level. I think the Nexus was an absolutely fantastic dungeon, but it's fair to say that its level 80 only follow-up was a bit more contentious. The troll dungeons of Gundrak and Drakthron Keep were both...
Gundrak was my favorite dungeon, and my favorite part about the dungeon was after you killed the second boss, you'd have to jump down into the water, and you'd have to swim across to the third boss, and there would be these little piranhas, and the piranhas would attack you, and if you were a cloth wearer, like there's a huge difference between cloth wearers and plate wearers back then with like how much damage you took from mobs. These little fucking piranhas would eat you alive. So what I would do is that if there was somebody in the group that I didn't like, I would act like I was going to jump down, because I'd usually be tanking, and I would let them jump down, like the mage, and he would jump down, and the piranhas would swarm him and kill him. It was the best part about the entire dungeon. I love Gundrak.
Both really solid offerings, and while the Hulls of Stone was a little bit on the average side, Hulls of Lightning was really, really damn cool. As for Violet Hold, well, like its Legion reincarnation, it sucked back in the day as well. We then had the fantastic Azul Narub and Ankahet, the Fallen Kingdom. These big dungeons were in the massive, sprawling world of Azul Narub, which of course we did not get as a leveling zone, which was sad, but nonetheless, they were fantastic dungeons. And then finally, we had the Culling of Stratholme, which retold the story of Arthas' character-defining fork-in-the-road decision, where he ultimately decided to purge the city. I'm really not sure if this is a fantastic dungeon, but I do remember enjoying it quite a bit back in the day.
It wasn't.
The pacing was really fast initially, especially...
It sucked.
Especially if you want to do a time run to get the Drake mount, and I suppose that did make it memorable for me. Overall, Wrath had a host of great dungeons, at least in terms of their content. They absolutely did do their job well, at least in the level up process. So, loads of new zones, loads of new dungeons. Overall, how did the leveling of Wrath stack up? In short, fantastically. It was just the best that the game had ever seen. Unlike the overly linear questing of the Cataclysm, it managed to strike a balance between set pieces, linear sections, and open-ended design, which delivered a player-driven journey through Northrend that took you through diverse lands that had you defeating...
I think there's not even a question in my mind. Wrath of the Lich King questing was just better than Burning Crusade. Like, Burning Crusade quests were, I mean, they weren't really that good. Like, Burning Crusade, like, the zones, the quests, everything like that, they weren't really that good. Like, Burning Crusade was good because of its philosophy. Wrath, I think, was good because of the actual content itself, if that makes sense. Legrand? Yeah, go kill 30 Windrocks. Come back to him. All right, now kill 30 of the bigger Windrocks. You know, like, you had to do that how many fucking times, dude? The quest sucked.
Diverse enemies, and this was all greatly aided by the fact that you did have the Titan and the Nexus War subplots, and then welcome breaks in pace like the Tuskar and Sholazar Basin. Now, it's important to remember that we were still in a very different era of the game. It really wasn't as much of a fast-paced, gameplay-oriented experience as it is now. The journey really did take precedence for many players, and Northrend was perfectly designed for that. The strong world design, the music, the narrative, and the questing, that's all part of why Wrath was critically acclaimed upon launch, having improved on the Burning Crusade's equivalent content, at least for the leveling, in every way. But
Agreed.
that's not everything, because we need to talk about the end game. So, the world was tremendous, but MMOs, even back in 2008, they would have to live or die by their end game.
That's
now,
right.
With Wrath,
That's
this
what matters.
end game would vary wildly as the expansion progressed. On launch, Wrath is best categorized as an accessible version of the Burning Crusade, but with a few extra bells and whistles. Now, seeing the success of TBC, Blizzard likely wanted to open that experience up to more players. So, like TBC before it, Wrath's endgame consisted of dungeons, raids, PvP professions, and reputations.
Exciting.
None of that should be surprising to a modern World of Warcraft player, but what might be surprising is the slower pace. Now, to be clear, the pace of Wrath was blistering as compared to the Burning Crusade, but not so much when compared to the game as we find it today. So players would be doing daily quests for the game's many factions. Now, first, those factions did have some really cool mount rewards, but also, importantly, they had vital pre-raid gear as well as useful enchantments that would be needed. Now,
on top of that, even, in order to get the, I remember this is one specific example, in order to get the blue version of the gems that you needed to craft for like Critical Strike, you needed to get revered, I think, with Sons of Hodir. So there were actual reasons, and because it was harder to get revered with Sons of Hodir, it created a value through scarcity that people that were able to go through that quest line as a jewel crafter gained through doing that. That isn't just an innate value of getting the reputation itself, but also now you have the privilege to create an item that so many people need that is unique to just you and everybody else who did that thing. So walking those patterns behind the reputations actually created a bigger incentive for people to work towards their professions, because they knew if they could do both of them, they would get money.
The dailies were about on par with those of the Burning Crusade, and to be honest, I found them somewhat engaging but not amazing. Now, WoW was still young, and it's important to remember that getting the basic rewards was still exciting to people. Progression was quite simple and quite fair, so investing time into that content just felt reasonable and worthwhile to people.
Progression was
let's
fair.
Get into the cycles of gameplay. So most players would be doing their dailies.
That's
then
true.
Wintergrasp would be another vital part of their gameplay. Now, this battle would kick off every few hours, and it would bring in players from all around the world.
It would bring in all of the Alliance Kel'Thuzad players, and it would bring in all 2 of the Horde Kel'Thuzad players. And we would take these tanks here, and we would aim all of the tanks directly on top of the graveyard that the Horde players would spawn in. And as soon as they left the invulnerability barrier, they would be immediately deleted by a barrage of fucking tanks and artillery that is like, it felt like it was like Afghanistan or something. It was a bad time for them. And the determination buff, it didn't matter how much health they had, they were going to die in like 1 second anyway. It doesn't even matter.
You would earn Wintergrasp commendations, which would get you some pretty decent rewards, but importantly, victory would give you access to the Vault of Archivon. Now, this initially one-boss raid was very easy, and essentially it did act as a chance of some free loot. Not so much that it would greatly devalue gear, and it did have the benefit that, well, it would give people a nice little dip into a raid-like experience that, unlike the modern world bosses of current expansions, still kind of felt like raid content because it was a pre-made group. Now, Wintergrasp was not balanced on most servers, and it was not a perfect system by any means.
No, it wasn't,
what I will
was
say,
it?
Though, is that it did its
sure
job
wasn't.
quite well. It gave pace to Wrath's endgame, and it provided a valuable activity for casual players that didn't really take away from the hardcores. Now, as for Wintergrasp itself, I think people just wanted the fantasy of a big siege, and largely that is what they got. Now, Vault of Archivon wasn't the only small raid in this expansion. We also had Sartharian's Lair, which...
See, here's what they need to do. Is they need to make one of the new brawls, and I don't know why they don't do this. They said they were going to do this, but I don't know if this is ever going to happen. They need to make the brawls that they have, instead of brawl for, what is this here? Not Cooking Impossible. Nobody gives a fuck about that. Like, just go ahead and scale up Wintergrasp or Tolbarad to level 120, or scale everybody down to 80. It doesn't matter which way you do it. And then have everybody be able to queue into that, create an instance zone, or allow people to go in there and phase them into different instance zones, and allow them to participate in Wintergrasp and Tolbarad now that there are mechanisms that create parity between Alliance and the Horde, which obviously don't really work that well, but it's better than the way that it was. And you'd be able to go back, do these fucking, these sieges and everything, and people could legitimately experience what Wintergrasp was supposed to be for, in many people's circumstance, the first time. And even for people that did it back then, the first time in the way that it was supposed to be. Because what I'm saying here is the fact that there are a lot of people who, classic release, it comes out, when did I do this? There are many people who were on a server that was completely unbalanced. There was nothing really for them to do. They would just go in there and just one-shot everything, give people that authentic Wintergrasp experience that they didn't receive back in Wrath because their server wasn't balanced.
This day is one of my favorite instances because of its difficulty mechanic. It's actually one of the first examples of a heroic mode. So her room had 3 mini-bosses and a bunch of trash. If you killed all of the mini-bosses and then killed her, that was Sarth 0D. It was really easy because the boss just had some pretty clear and simple mechanics that I'd say were a really good introduction to raiding. Now, if you left the mini-bosses alive, then they would join the fight, and that made it much harder. Sarth 1D, 2D, and 3D were all quite hard, and they would give you greater and greater rewards. And that really was an important thing. It was probably the hardest content in the game at the time.
It was.
If you saw somebody with the Drake mount reward from Sarth 3D, you knew they meant business. And then finally there was a third one, boss raid, which was the Eye of Eternity, that had a simple enough achievement that players would be able to unlock decently quickly. Yeah. Now, all of this meant that casual players had quite a lot of stuff to do every week, and best of all, it was pretty good quality content that didn't waste their time. Then on the dungeon front, Wrath continued the Burning Crusades heroic difficulty mode, but
See, Wrath actually did a really good job at having entry-level raids, and the difficulty of the Wrath entry-level raids is what I wanted to see LFR be. That's where I want to see LFR go. I don't want LFR to just be like some kind of a brain-dead participation reward system where you just complete everything while you're AFK. I want LFR to be a separate difficulty that players create groups for on their own so they can actually have social experiences in the MMO that we played called World of Warcraft, right? Wrath of the Lich King probably did more for casual players than LFR could ever hope to.
Name only, because it was far easier. For casual players, now, failure rates still were high enough, especially with bosses like Halls of Lightning's Loken, and I would argue that it was actually quite well targeted towards most of that section of the player base. But the problem was that experienced players, especially those in guilds, found these heroics to be trivial. Where they previously had really challenging heroics, they now had cakewalks. And sure, the TBC ones were eventually made easy with gear, but that was a process that was far slower than it was with Wrath.
Here's why the Wrath dungeons were easier. It wasn't necessarily because they did more damage. It was because tanks were much better at generating threat. They had so many more tools to generate threat and get aggro. That was whenever tanks were actually able to start doing damage. You had better AoE abilities, and classes became stronger overall. And it's the same argument that I make to where if you scale up Molten Core, it's still not going to be as hard as it was in Classic, because players have so many different options nowadays to deal with problems. And the amount of utility that players received in Wrath of the Lich King made the same dungeons that they were getting in Burning Crusade easier, even though they had the same relative values in Wrath of the Lich King, because they had all these new tools to deal with them.
Sadly for these...
It's like basically, it's like Batman with his utility belt in Wrath versus without his utility belt in Burning Crusade.
Experienced players, Wrath of the Lich King's first raid would really disappoint. Naxxramas had been reused from vanilla, but unlike the initial version that so few players had seen in vanilla, the Wrath one was easy. It was a joke to people who had just cleared the Sunwell, and indeed it was cleared in a historically low amount of time, meaning that many guilds just finished a lot of the content early. Nax was, however, a great introduction for newer raiders.
There it is.
You can kind of see it as being the Highmaul of this expansion, but only if Highmaul didn't have a mythic mode to actually keep the bleeding edge players happy. On reflection, I think that the main problem is that Nax 25 was undertuned. You see, Wrath made big changes.
We one-shot Kel'Thuzad 25, man. Like, we literally went in there, my guild, the first time that we ever pulled the boss, we killed it. Like, it was so embarrassing. I mean, like, obviously we had deaths, and it was pretty close. But the first time, think about that, the first time we pulled the boss, we just killed it on on the first try. It was insane.
Changes to raid difficulties, and raids came in both a 10 and 25 player mode, with 10 being easier and 25 being harder. So 10 being easy and kind of accessible, that was totally fine. But, well, the option that was in place for the dedicated players just was not up to par. This, along with the easier than
immortal
expected
achievement,
dungeons,
basically,
led to widespread criticism of Wrath of the Lich King's endgame. Now, it still did perform quite well, and that likely made it clear to Blizzard that serving this casual audience was a worthwhile ambition. Wrath of the Lich King would go on to, well, essentially nail this balance. But then their subsequent response to this throughout Cataclysm, Mists, and beyond would really define many of World of Warcraft's modern struggles. Now, much like the content,
that's about
gearing
right.
and progression is also best
That
described
is about
as being
right.
an accessible version of the Burning Crusade. Badges of Justice were gone, now being replaced with a two-tier system, where you would have emblems of heroism from 10-man raids and from dungeons, and then emblems of valor from the 25-player content. Now, these currencies could be handed in for gear from a vendor, which...
Do you hear that?
The two-tier system,
Listen
where
to this.
you would have emblems of heroism from 10-man raids and from dungeons, and then emblems of valor from the 25-player content. Now, these currencies could be handed in for gear from a vendor, which meant that they provided a stable form of progression and bad luck protection.
Wow!
Now, the slower nature of progression as compared to life is exemplified by the item levels.
Oh my god.
Dropped 187 gear, but their end bosses could drop a bit of item level 200 gear. Then 10-player raids would drop item level 200 gear, and 25-player raids would drop 213 gear. Yup. The entire initial endgame spanned 26 item levels. Contrast that to BFA, where it right now spans like, what, 300 to 385, and you really see the difference. Gearing was slower, and the range of item levels was also smaller. You would not replace gear as often, and even though there was a lot of loot as compared to the Burning Crusade, the progression still was paced such that upgrades did feel impactful. Now, for the casual players who did not get the Nax Ramus loot bonanza, gearing was a well-paced hybrid of lucky drops from heroic end bosses, doing their daily quests for rep, partaking in...
Because each of the end bosses in the heroics, you would be able to do them, and there was a chance that it would drop an epic item. It would always, I think it would always drop one epic item, but you didn't know which one it was going to be. So you would want to run it every single week. Like, so like for me, there was the Red Sword of Courage, which dropped from King Yimron and Utgard Pinnacle. That was the best tanking sword that I could get outside of Nax Ramus, which obviously the tanks in my guild would have priority for. So I would run it every single week in order to get that item. Or every single day in order to get that item.
Wintergrasp, and then dabbling in a few of the smaller raids. So these emblems were a really important part of the gearing process for both groups of players, though it was clear that heroism was not really paced with gilded players in mind, because they could knock out every dungeon in a day, and that would give them enough tokens for a bit of item level 200 gear from the vendor, which is of course 10-player raid quality. Now, if you were doing the same amount of content but spread out over a week, then that progression would feel quite well paced. Now, WoW was still a game where you could sit down at this stage and you could sit down with a bit of paper and you could work out a gearing list and pursue it. And I think that was a really big core strength. It was less exciting, yes, but it really meant that the accomplishment of specific goals was really paramount, and I think that felt quite meaningful to players.
Listen to this again. This right here is, I think, at the very core of the problem with the philosophy of the current game. This right here is what's wrong. Listen to the difference between these two things, right? The excitement versus accomplishment.
Quite well paced. Now, WoW was still a game where you could sit down at this stage and you could sit down with a bit of paper and you could work out a gearing list and pursue it. And I think that was a really big core strength. It was less exciting, yes, but it really meant that the accomplishment of specific goals was really paramount, and I think that felt quite meaningful to players. Now, past that, you would be spending...
See, like, look at even the vocabulary that Bellular uses, right? You have excitement, and then accomplishments and meaningful, right? The other words, like kind of like that are at odds with each other. Excitement and meaning is what really counts and what matters. And you compare that with what we have now, or sorry, meaning and like accomplishment is what matters. And what we have now is excitement. So it's just like the entire, like the emotion behind the game isn't there.
Spending time hunting down enchantments from reputations and from professions.
That's
You'd be
right.
color matching your gems and you'd be theory crafting to get the ideal mix of stats while still maintaining your hit and expertise caps as well as the defense cap if you were a tank. Now, those caps were not exciting, but they did sort of add to the sense of progression, and they gave you some initial goals besides item level, which was less of a be-all, end-all back then than it really is today. What else were people doing? Well, at this stage, you've got to remember that WoW was only 4 years old. The basics were just more interesting than they are today, and in many cases, they were also paced slower. So things like earning money to get the Traveler's Tundra Mammoth, that really motivated people and provided a good goal. Gold inflation was also quite reasonable, and the market, at least from my memory, was quite healthy, being supported by an economy that was really quite fun to engage with. I still remember pouring hours into the Saronite and Cobalt shuffles, as well as all of the different gold blogs that I'd read back in the day. So in short, the story—
I would never do any of that. The only thing that I would ever do is I would just farm shit out. I would farm out like low-level dungeons. I don't know why I thought that was fun to do, but for whatever reason I really enjoyed that, and I would AoE farm low-level dungeons and just sell rune cloth, because for whatever reason people would still buy rune cloth so they could turn it into the other different factions to get the special mounts.
The story of Wrath of the Lich King's launch endgame is really the story of how it was experienced differently by the casual and hardcore players. Blizzard had, though, for the first time, thrown a bit of a new spanner into the works, because it also brought the Death Knight. So how did the Death Knight pan out? Well,
It was completely overpowered, and it ruined the game, and it completely trivialized half of the encounters in Naxxramas, and especially Sartharion, because of the amount of ways they can deal with Sartharion's breath whenever all the dragons were up. And it also ruined PvP, because Death Knights were actually so powerful that they had to remove an achievement at 2000. If you won 10 games in a row, you got this title called the Flawless Victor. And the problem is that Death Knights were, as a bug, receiving that title as soon as they hit level 80. And Blizzard fixed that bug by removing the title entirely because of how overpowered Death Knights were. You would literally put down a Death and Decay, and it would do a better job at CCing you than a Mists of Pandaria crowd control chain. It would fear you over, and it was the most disgusting thing I'd ever seen.
Knights began in their new starting zone, and it was incredible. It was perhaps the best crafted narrative sequence the team had ever made, and they really nailed the quests as well. The whole thing was very engaging. Being able to play the villain was really damn fun, and it just, to be honest, it felt fresh, mowing people down, hopping on a dragon and mowing them down again. Seeing the Lich King and questing at his behest was all really darn cool, and they wove that narratively really well into the continent of Northrend, such that DKs would feel quite well motivated. Now, the Death Knight was utterly overpowered at launch. Now, the follow-up 3.0.x patches, they would continually rebalance the class, but in many ways it was just tricky because of their design, because technically they could tank in any spec. That might seem wild today, but that's just how the old school talent system kind of worked. They dealt a ton of damage, they were rock hard to kill, it made them unstoppable, and they were still very strong after they were being tuned downwards. Now,
that's right, because every single spec you would use for tanking. So you had Frost, which was the versatile tanking spec. You had Unholy, which was more the AoE tanking spec, and you had Blood, which was the heavy boss hit tanking spec that you'd use for like tanking Sartharion. So it doesn't matter what spec that you were playing on your DK, you were fucking overpowered because of how strong you were and the fact that every spec was also built around tanking. So imagine me, a warrior, trying to fight a DK that has a 48% chance to parry. Like, it was the worst thing. Like, I remember I would fucking explode whenever I would get my attacks parried by a DK like 4 times in a row. It's like I couldn't even do anything. It made me so goddamn mad.
While Frost was the primary talent tree for tanks, you could actually get by with others, which is of course very different from the modern Death Knight, which all stems from the Cataclysm Death Knight changes, which made Blood be the dedicated tanking spec, with Frost and Unholy being dedicated DPS specs. Now, I'm not going to lie, playing a DK was fun. You were so powerful in day-to-day scenarios.
You were a hero class.
Silly.
That's what you were.
Leveling was especially funny as you chewed your way through Outland. Now, class mechanics aside, the experience of playing a Death Knight was just really strong. They started off in what's likely the best starter zone yet. Loads of fun quests, and it